What's up, everyone? Zack here with Cosmic Academy. Super excited to get started with you in a couple weeks. Now, before we even do that, I'd like to run you through a few really important fundamental things that are going to help so that when we get into the classes and specifically the one-on-ones, we can hit the ground running. We could jump right into your projects, see what you got going on under the hood, that sort of thing. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on a few things that are really important for overall quality of sound. Now, none of this is going to be hard. None of this is DAW specific. This will apply for everyone. And this is really just getting us a strong foundation so that as we go through the production process, we can give ourselves the best opportunity for quality. A great way to think about this is, imagine you have this path from when the time you start your project to the time you finish. Ideally, we'd like to stay on this path of quality the whole way. But if we start to veer off that path early on, by the time we get to the end of our project, it's very hard to get back to that center line, which represents quality. So basically what I'm trying to say is a lot of what determines the overall quality of your song is based on decisions you're making the second you open up your project. The second you start crafting your sounds, whether you realize it or not, there are things you can be doing to ensure quality in the end, and that's what we're going to take a look at. So let's get into it. The next important thing we're going to go over is the order of processing. So let me just play this for you, and we'll take a look at the sound we're going to use as an example. Now, if you look on Ableton, the signal flows from left to right. Logic is top to bottom, so is FL Studio top to bottom. In Ableton, we're working left to right. So we start from this sampler with a sample in it. And as you can see, we flow through a saturator, an EQ, a compressor, the drum bus, corrective EQ, delay, reverb, sidechain. Now, this order matters. Is there one way to go about this order and one way to go about processing? The answer is no. There's never one way to do anything when it comes to music. However, you can't just randomly put these plugins on this chain and expect to achieve quality in the end, because this can get messy very quick. Knowing that our signal flows from left to right, there are certain things we need to be mindful of. For example, if you start compressing reverbs or distorting reverbs, things are going to get messy quick. So let's go over an order that makes sense. Keep in mind, we can break this order, but I always find it's easier to understand the rules first, understand what works, then we can make sense of breaking those rules, breaking that order. So let's take a look at this graphic. We're always going to start with the source. Now, this could be a synth sound, this could be your sample that you're working with, but it's going to be the source signal wherever your sound stems from. If you're going to saturate, typically we saturate first. We will go over saturation in class, but for starters, it's going to add distortion to your signal, but it's not that nasty digital distortion, the crackle or the crunch. Think of this as more subtle, hard to hear harmonics that get added to your signal. So the noise and distortion that's added to your signal is actually pleasant. It's harmonic saturation. Again, we'll cover that in detail during the class, but understand that would come first. Next is going to be our coloring EQ. Think of this as an extension of sound design. You might be boosting, you might be subtracting, but you're shaping and sculpting your synth sound, your instrument like a guitar, piano, a vocal. But this EQ has nothing to do with the overall mix, everything to do with further shaping your individual sound. Again, this is something we are going to cover in much more detail during the class. I'm going to show you how to go about this process, but for now, just keep that in mind. The coloring EQ is going to come after saturation, and that's just an extension of sound design, further sculpting your instrument. Now, compression, if we're going to compress, would come here at this stage. We will set rules in the second week of class of when to use compression. We will fully understand compression in week 2. But for now, if you're going to use compression, it would come in this stage rather early in the chain, as you can see. So if we think about the source, saturation, coloring EQ, and compression, these things kind of get our sound ready to be put into the mix. We've colored it, we've shaped it slightly, we've balanced it and created consistency with compression. Now it's time to dress this thing up and put it in the mix. So after this would come some of our modulation effects, specialty effects. The example I had in my sound was the drum bus plugin. You might use a chorus, a phaser, a flanger, some colorful distortion like decapitator, something like that. But this would come here in the order. Now, following this up is going to be another EQ. It's okay to have multiple EQs in one signal chain. This EQ we are going to call the corrective EQ. And what we're able to do is further sculpt the sound, right? You might have gained new frequencies from the modulation and specialty effects that came right before this. You could use another EQ to clean up. You can also use this EQ for mixing purposes, making our colorful sound now fit in the mix with everything else. So there's a big difference between the two EQs. The first EQ was all about the individual sound, sculpting it, coming up with a sound that you like, a sound that you want to put into your song. The second EQ, this corrective one later in the chain, is further cleanup, but more importantly, now making this colorful sound fit in the mix with the other competing sounds. We're going to go through some great examples during the program of how to fit sounds together, how to do corrective EQ, how to make your instruments fit in the mix. But keep in mind, this is mixing. This is creating balance between different sounds in the mix. That's what corrective EQ is for. Now, as we get to the end of the chain, we really narrow it down to spatial effects and side chain. So this will include things like delay, reverb, and then obviously where we want to place our side chain. So we have wiggle room with these three. In most cases, let's just talk about the spatial effects. Delay is going to come before reverb. So delay, generally speaking, is the repetition of your sound in context of an overall space. Now reverb helps us create that overall space. So those delays, by coming first before the reverb, happen in context of the overall space that reverb's creating. That's nice. That's what we want. Now let's pretend we put a delay after a reverb. Reverb is that continuation of your sound. I'm sure by now you've at least messed with it, but it creates this environment, and it's the continuation of your sound in that environment. If you have a delay after a reverb, and let's say your reverb has this nice lush 3-second tail on it, what's going to happen if the delay is after the reverb? That 3-second tail is going to repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. And before you know it, that reverb is just going to wash over itself and create a mess in your mix. So this is something that can get out of hand extremely quick. And in most cases, delay comes before reverb to solve this issue. Now, quick example of how we could break that rule. Imagine you have a very short reverb, something like an ambient style reverb, couple hundred milliseconds. Maybe it's going on a drum layer. In that case, you can get away with a delay after the reverb because the reverb isn't long enough to repeat over itself. Each time the delay re-triggers that sound and it echoes and repeats and repeats, the reverbs aren't going to overlap each other because they're so short in their decay time. So understanding the rules allows us to break those rules. But in most cases, you're going to find delay before reverb. Finally, what do we do with sidechain? We really have two spots that sidechain will fit, and it's after the spatial effects or before spatial effects. The difference being, what do you want to also pump? Now, if it comes at the end of the chain, after everything, your entire signal is going to pump and duck. Maybe let's say around the kick drum, right? That's usually what we sidechain. So in this instance, your source, which would be the synth or the drum sample, with all of the processing, including the repetitions and the reverb space, everything pumps when sidechain is at the end of the chain. That's great for over-the-top kind of sidechain effect, right? A drop, some high energy moments where you want everything pumping really hard. Sidechain at the end is great for that. What happens though if you're making a chill song, something that's a lower BPM, more of a chill vibe? Maybe it's even just the breakdown of a song where energy levels come down. In those instances, sometimes you might find sidechain at the end of the chain after spatial effects. You might find that pump to be too violent, too aggressive, and it doesn't match the energy level at that moment in your song or the vibe of your song. So in that case, what you could do is you could have sidechain before delay and reverb. And in this instance now, your instrument will pump, but the environment itself won't. The reverb and delay remain more stationary while your signal pumps before them. So the room itself isn't pumping and overdoing that effect. So again, that works better sometimes in chill moments of a song or just chill songs and chill genres overall. We have the ability though to move that and place it where we want to achieve the sound we want. And that's what's most important with this order. Understanding that the order matters, but if we can reason with ourselves, we can break this order. A great sound design example, sometimes putting compression after a reverb can create this like mega sized space that's so over the top, but it actually sounds cool. And if we could understand that we have the potential to destroy the sound by putting the compressor after the reverb, blowing it up, as long as we understand that that can happen, we can kind of slowly go through that process, make sure we're doing it to an extent where it's not destroying the mix, we're subtly using it, and we're achieving something that might be breaking the rules we wouldn't be able to achieve otherwise, but it's because we understand the order, we understand the risks at hand, and we can slowly go through that process and make sense of it. So this is a very safe order. If you always want to start from this order, you can't go wrong, but you can always reason from here. So this is something to keep in mind coming into the class. If you have this down, you will have a massive advantage when we start getting into the meat and bones of the songwriting, arrangement, production, mixing, and mastering stuff that we're going to cover. The final thing I want to take a look at is using effects as a channel insert versus a send and return. Now, keep in mind, I'm going to be doing this in Ableton. Sends and returns exist in all of your DAWs, so you might have to just hop on Google real quick or YouTube, just watch a quick tutorial, how to use the sends and returns. You just need to locate them and understand how to start using them. We're going to talk today, though, about what's actually happening to the signal. That's universal. So what we're going to understand here will apply for your DAW. It's just figuring out how to set up that routing. It might look a little bit different than what I'm showing you, but it exists and it will affect your signal the same way. So this is a game changer when we talk about using effects like reverb as a channel insert versus sends and returns, because this again factors in to your overall quality. And I will say, this is probably one of the things a lot of tutorials show that is causing you to have quiet, weak mixes when it's all said and done. So let's take this first example of, I have a drum group and let's just pretend I wanted reverb on these drums. Now, I'm going to drop the reverb directly on my drum group. As you can see, I have Valhalla Room on the drums. And sure enough, as I increase the mix knob, we gain reverb. But here's what's actually happening to the signal. When you use a plugin on a reverb, a delay, or any kind of effect, truthfully, that has a mix knob or a dry wet parameter, as you increase the wet, you gain the effect, but keep in mind, you are also losing the original dry signal. So if you look at my hands for a second, if this at 0%, this is our drum group, which is, let's think of the characteristics, in your face, transient, punchy, loud, crisp, clean, clear, all the above. That's the sound with no reverb. Now, as I start to increase this mix parameter, this hand back in the back right now represents the reverb. We will gain reverb, but we will lose original dry signal at the expense of the reverb. So we gain reverb, but we lose original dry signal. So think about what we're going to lose. The transients, the volume, the punch, the clarity, all of those things that make the drums sound like drums, we're going to lose as we gain reverb. You gain one, but you lose the other. Take a listen. Okay, so that's obvious, right? Now, you might be sitting there being Like, hey, you just went to 100. Of course it's going to sound like that. True. But it also means as soon as we start increasing this knob or this parameter, this fader, what are we inching closer to? This sound. So even if you put it at 20 to 30%, your original signal is still 20 to 30% weaker. You're losing transients, you're losing volume, you're losing that upfront feel to gain reverb. So where a lot of tutorials just tell you, oh, drop it on 20%, drop it on 30%, they usually leave out the fact that you're also losing 20% of your original signal. This is really going to handicap your mix when it comes to overall loudness and volume. So then where are we left here? It's I want reverb on these drums, but I don't want to lose original signal. How can I do that? This is where sends and returns come into play. So the difference being, I'm going to show you with my hands first, then we're going to go in and set up the actual signal flow. What's happening is with a send and return, I'm going to have my original drums again. Now, instead of gaining reverb and losing the original drums, like the insert was, with a send and return, we can keep our drums and gain reverb. But notice what we don't have to lose, the original drums themselves. So how this works, I have the exact same reverb already set up right now on this return channel right here. So you can see this is the same reverb that we had. The settings are the same. Let me even bypass what the other things I have on here. So here's going to be the difference. On this return channel, I have a reverb. Now, how it works is this first box corresponds with the first return channel. The second box corresponds with the second return channel, and so forth. What we do is we send duplicate volume from the drum group. As I increase this number on the box, it's sending duplicate volume to this return channel down here. So the volume that's being sent to the return channel, it's simple. The return channel has one job. You accept that volume, you process it through your signal chain. In this case, we have a reverb, and then that volume gets put back into the mix parallel to the original drums. So your drums send volume to this return channel, which has a reverb. It reverberates and pushes it right back into the mix. So we're gaining reverb without losing the original drums because it is a duplicate signal. Listen to the difference now. As I increase the volume on this send parameter, it will return reverb, but listen to the original drums. We are not going to lose the transients, the loudness, the clarity, and all of that. So we kept the click of the snare, the kick. The hi-hats were still punchy. Now listen to the difference in real time. If we do on, that's the insert versus send and return. So what's nice about this is when you use a send and return, it gives you separate control over the volume of your original sound and the desired effect, reverb, delay, whatever you put on this send and return. Now, important to keep in mind, when you have an effect on a return channel like we do, the mix has to be set to 100% wet. And the reason why is you already have 100% dry. As you send that dry signal to the reverb, you want it to only return reverb. So you want to make sure that that reverb is set to 100%. You want to make sure that delay is set to 100% wet. Only when you use sends and returns, you want to make sure the effect is set to 100% wet. But how can we use this to our advantage now? Does that mean we're never going to just drop reverbs on our sounds and use them like maybe we were originally? Of course not. There's still a use for this, but it's using it to its advantage. So let's separate this. Sends and returns. When and where should we think to use them first? Not always, but where should we think to use them first? Sends and returns are great for important sounds. Think about what makes a sound important. Usually, first and foremost, it's upfront in your face, right? The volume, the clarity, it's right up in front of the mix. If we use a send and return, we can maintain that position up front in the mix and still gain the effect of a reverb or a delay. So important sounds, sends and returns, are usually the better bet. Now for secondary elements in your mix, which a lot of elements are secondary. Think about the things further back in the mix. These, you might be better off using the reverb as an insert or the delay as an insert, because as you start to increase the mix parameter, what happens to your original signal? Well, it gets softer. It gets further away. It gets washed out. That's actually good for secondary elements in a mix because they should be back behind those important elements. So for secondary sounds or secondary layers, using an effect like this as an insert, dropping it on the channel, is your better bet. For important sounds or lead layers or important layers, using a send and return is probably your best bet because it maintains the original signal and you can add the desired effect behind. So we will use both, but it's using them to their strengths so that we can maintain clarity, loudness in a mix, and we could even get further depth in a mix by using it as an insert. One more thing I want to show with return channels, because this is a separate channel in your track, you can process this independently from the actual instrument that it's going to be added to. So in this case, right, we're going to send the drums, we're going to add a reverb to the drums. But let's say I start EQing this return channel with a reverb. Is it going to EQ the drums or the reverb? The answer would be only the reverb because this is a separate track independent from the drums. So I can EQ the reverb separate from the drums. I can't do that if I just drop the reverb directly on my drum group. If I put an EQ after this, it's going to affect, yes, the reverb, but also the drums, right? So by using the send and return, I could even clean this reverb up. I'll give you an example where I'm just going to turn this EQ on and off so you could hear the difference. Without it, we're sending our drums to the reverb and it's muddy, right? It kind of sounds horrible because the kick is so heavy. Look at how the EQ allows the drums to be so much cleaner and clearer. So let's talk about EQ on a return channel. With reverb, a lot of times you'll see most tutorials and people tell you, clean up after the reverb. You don't want the reverb to put any low end back into your mix. That is 100% true. But there's another thing we need to think about. If you're sending elements that have low end or low mids anywhere in this area, allowing those frequencies to hit the reverb can overwhelm the reverb and create a pretty muddy sound, as we heard here. Now, if I only use an EQ after to clean up the shitty sounding reverb, I'm just polishing a turd at that point. I'm not fixing the original quality of the reverb. We're just polishing the pretty terrible sounding reverb. Why not make the reverb sound better? So in order to do that, by cutting some of that low end before the reverb, we don't allow those frequencies to overwhelm the sound, to drown it out and make it muddy. So by cutting low end first, it allows us to get this cleaner reverb sound. Sure, afterwards, I could also still clean up any low end that might have been added back from the reverb itself. As you could see, it did introduce some low end again. But listen to how clean this is. If I take both of these off, let's go like this. We're getting the punchiness of the drums, the clarity of the drums. We're adding a clean reverb signal. This is all because sends and returns give us this separate control. It allows us to process the reverb in the return channel separate from the source. One final cool thing you'll be able to do is, let's say, maybe you're sending some leads or a vocal to a reverb on a return channel. You could even put sidechain on this. So you can have this pump around your kick. If you had a vocal going to a reverb return, you could have it sidechaining back to the original vocal. These are some cool things we'll be able to mess around with in your projects when we do some of the one-on-ones. But just keep in mind the sends and returns, you can process those return channels to get further clarity, make these things fit your mix even better. So I wanted to quickly add that to the difference of inserts and sends and returns. To sum everything up, these few things we looked at today are extremely basic, they're extremely dry, and they're kind of boring. I get that. It's why most tutorials don't talk about these things. However, these are instrumental in terms of achieving that professional quality sound that we are going to be going after during the 5-week program and beyond. So what I'd like everyone to do is practice these things, start to build them as habits so that when classes start, you're already implementing these things and not even having to think about them anymore. It almost becomes muscle memory as you apply them. So maybe for the first week or two, tape notes to your desk so you're thinking about healthy green signals, eyeballs always scanning your output meters. You're aware of the order of processing. You're using sends and returns versus inserts correctly. As soon as these things become second nature, it will allow us to take those next steps forward and, start looking at some more detailed ways we can achieve quality of sound. But I hope this was helpful. This is just the start, and I look forward to sitting down with you in class and the one-on-ones and getting after it and really taking a look at your music and getting the most out of it. So see you soon, and until then, keep practicing, keep working on music.